Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to look at one of the most absolutely consequential events in human history. We usually hear about the fall of Rome as this sudden, dramatic collapse. But the historical truth we're unpacking today, it's actually a lot more like a really messy, drawn-out breakup. We're exploring the grand divorce of antiquity, how the Roman Empire deliberately split itself right down the middle, and how the battle lines drawn by that divorce are literally the exact same borders shaping our geopolitical map today in 2026. If you've ever gone through a massive corporate restructuring or, a spectacular divorce, you know exactly how it goes. Think of the Roman Empire not as some delicate vase shattering into a million pieces, but more like a giant macaroni noodle just snapping comically in half. Rome didn't just vanish, it divided its assets. The Mediterranean world had simply become way too vast, too complex, and honestly, way too threatened for just one headquarters in Italy to manage the whole shebang. So to understand how our modern world works, we first have to answer this fundamental question. Is the Roman Empire actually dead, or did it just legally separate? Section 1. An empire out of control. Let's look at why this massive fracture had to happen in the first place. You see, before the split, Rome almost didn't even make it out of the 200s. They hit what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. The empire was basically acting like a giant corporation collapsing under its own bloated weight. I'm talking nonstop civil wars where generals just kept declaring themselves emperor left and right, devastating plagues completely wiping out the workforce, and hyperinflation so bad that Roman coins essentially became worthless. It's like the sheer geographic scale of the empire meant that by the time news of an invasion in Britain actually reached Rome, a totally separate crisis in Syria had already spiraled way out of control. One CEO simply wasn't going to cut it anymore. And this sheer geographic exhaustion, well, it led to a legal separation in stages. It starts in 293 AD. Emperor Diocletian realized the ultimate truth. He literally couldn't be everywhere at once. So he instituted the Tetrarchy, dividing the realm into 4 parts. It was just a pure administrative necessity. But, human nature being what it is, 4 rulers eventually simplified into a much starker divide: the Latin West and the Greek East. Now, this wasn't the end just yet, but the paperwork for the divorce had officially been filed. So, the crucial point is the final cut, which arrives in 395 AD. Emperor Theodosius I passes away, and upon his death, the empire is officially and permanently divided between his 2 sons. Honorius takes the west, and Arcadius takes the east. Now, it wasn't meant to be hostile, but from this specific year forward, the 2 halves of the Roman Empire would never truly be united again. They were about to face 2 entirely different destinies. Section 2. The West's slow fade. Let's follow the tragic downward spiral of the Latin half. Things in the West went from bad to straight-up disastrous. First off, Rome itself was sidelined. The administrative capital shifted up to Milan and then ultimately to Ravenna, which was a city surrounded by swamps, chosen literally just because it was easy to hide in. And why were they hiding? Well, Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Vandals, and the mighty Huns were constantly pushing into Roman borders during the migration period. The real tragedy for the West was basically mathematical. They simply lacked the money to pay these tribes off, and they lacked the manpower to fight them off. They were completely broke and exhausted. And that brings us to a deeply somber moment. 476 AD. A Germanic chieftain named Odoacer marches in and quietly deposes the last Western emperor. This was a teenager who incredibly was named Romulus Augustulus, literally carrying the names of Rome's founder and its first emperor. You can't make that up. But Odoacer doesn't even bother to claim the title of emperor. Instead, he just boxes up the imperial regalia, the crown jewels of the West, and ships them over to the Eastern emperor. It was a clear, unmistakable signal. The West was no longer an empire. It had fractured into a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms. But here is what you absolutely need to take away from this. The administration collapsed, yes, plunging Europe into the Middle Ages. But the idea of Rome, that survived. It survived through the deeply ingrained structures of the Catholic Church, which essentially just adopted Roman administrative boundaries for its own diocese. And it survived right on our tongues. The Latin language spoken by the Roman legions slowly evolved into the Romance languages we know today: Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. If you speak one of these today, you are carrying a direct living legacy of the Western Roman Empire. Section 3. Byzantium, the golden survivor. Now let's shift our focus to the other half of the divorce. Because while the West was literally sinking into the mud, the East was having a massive, undeniable glow-up. I mean, just consider the sheer strategic brilliance of Constantinople, the so-called New Rome. The The East was already wealthier and much more urbanized, but they also controlled the ultimate trade crossroads of the world, connecting Europe to Asia. And they protected all that wealth with the Theodosian walls. Built on a highly defensible peninsula, these walls made Constantinople the most impenetrable, heavily fortified city on Earth. It would remain safe and secure for another 1,000 years. The East really reached its absolute zenith under Emperor Justinian I in the 6th century. Now, Justinian couldn't quite let the idea of a united Rome go. He launched these massive military campaigns to reconquer the West, temporarily taking back Italy and North Africa. But honestly, it was a ruinous vanity project that nearly bankrupted the East. However, his true, lasting legacy wasn't military at all. It was legal. Justinian ordered the compilation of the Corpus Juris Civilis, a massive refinement of Roman law. To put that into perspective, almost all modern European civil law is fundamentally based on this exact document today, a real game changer. Over the centuries, though, something totally fascinating happened, and this brilliantly illustrates how the East formed its own distinct identity. The Eastern Empire eventually just stopped pretending to be a Latin outpost. Greek officially replaced Latin as the language of government and culture. Simultaneously, religious differences deepened. The Church in the East, which we now call Eastern Orthodox, slowly drifted away from the authority of the Pope over in Rome. So the divorce wasn't just political anymore, right? It was linguistic, cultural, and spiritual. The whole shebang. Section 4. Two different fates. Let's put these two divorced halves head to head. Bringing the whole picture into sharp focus here, the contrast is just stark. In language, the West spoke Latin, the East spoke Greek. In economy, the West was agrarian, rural, cash-strapped, and totally fragmented. The East, heavily trade-based, urban, and immensely wealthy. Look at their fates. The West politically collapsed in 476 AD, while the East, the Byzantine Empire, endured against all odds until 1453 AD. And finally, their successors. The West gave birth to feudal Europe and the massive power of the Catholic Church. The East's ultimate successor, once it finally fell, became the Ottoman Empire territorially, while its spiritual mantle was taken up by the Orthodox Church. Section 5. The 2026 Perspective. The Great Cultural Divide. So why does this ancient history matter right now? Today? Let's move to 2026 and see how this ancient divide builds the exact reality we live in right now. When you look at the cultural map of Europe today, the border dividing the continent largely follows the exact same administrative lines drawn by Diocletian and Theodosius. It's wild. On one side, you have Western Europe, historically Catholic or Protestant, utilizing the Latin alphabet and rooted in Latin traditions. On the other side, Eastern Europe, historically Orthodox, utilizing Cyrillic or Greek-influenced alphabets and rooted in Byzantine traditions. The messy divorce of antiquity is quite literally the blueprint for modern European geopolitics. And this legacy drives actual modern tensions. When Constantinople, the Second Rome, finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the Orthodox center of gravity shifted north. Moscow explicitly claimed the title of the Third Rome. They deeply believed, and honestly in many cultural ways still do, that they were the true remaining heirs to the Roman imperial spirit and the defenders of the true faith. When you analyze the geopolitical friction in Eastern Europe today, you're often looking at tensions deeply rooted in this exact Roman inheritance. To summarize our deep dive today, the Roman Empire didn't just vanish into thin air. It evolved. The fractured West eventually became the foundation of the modern Atlantic world, powering the nations that would eventually colonize the Americas. Meanwhile, the eastern half became this heavy Byzantine shield that protected Europe from Eastern invasions for a full millennium. As the quote perfectly puts it, we're still looking at a map drawn by men in togas 1,700 years ago. I mean, how crazy is that? Which leaves us with this final provocative thought to ponder. As you digest everything we've looked at today, how should we really view this grand divorce? Was splitting the empire a catastrophic failure of ancient leadership, a clear sign of terminal decline? Or, considering that the eastern half survived for another 1,000 years, was it actually a brilliant administrative masterstroke that allowed at least half of the Roman dream to survive? Think about that the next time you look at a map of modern Europe. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.